Welcome to How the NFL Works, presented by Pan Am Football. I'm Max Dean, and today we're kicking off a brand new segment which we'll do once a month, in which I'll talk in depth about how a specific aspect of the NFL works. A few months ago, I did a video about how the salary cap works, and that's gone over well. So part of the growth of the Pan Am Football channel will be a video just like this one on the first Monday of every month. They will probably coincide with whatever the main event for the month is. For example, I'll do one on the draft next month. Find me on Twitter at Pan Am Football, and if you find the video useful, throw me a like and you can subscribe for new Pan Am Football content every week. Today is all about how NFL free agency works, and before we fully dive in, I'll lay out what we're going to cover today. First, we'll talk about the 4 ways a player can become a free agent, before briefly explaining the difference between an extension and a free agent contract. After that, I'll explain the various tags or tenders that can be used, from ERFA to the well-known franchise tag. To finish it off, I'll explain what the timeline of free agency looks like, and give you the important dates. So here we go. Keep in mind that everything I'm talking about here, I'm explaining in the context of the primary free agency period in March. So some of these rules change at different points in the year, but I can explain those another time. There are 4 ways a player can become a free agent. The first is the expiration of the player's contract. That means that the player completes his contract fully and has no remaining years under contract. This is pretty straightforward, and it would mean the player becomes a free agent on the first day of the new league year. If you're looking at players from this year who will likely fall under this category, Giants defensive lineman Leonard Williams and Texans wide receiver Will Fuller are both likely to become free agents in this way. The second is the player is released from his contract. That means that a team no longer wishes to employ that player under the parameters of his current contract, and he becomes free to sign with another team. You may also hear the word cut, which is synonymous with being released. In this case, the player would become a free agent on the date which he was released. This could be before or after the start of the new league year. For examples this year, both Texans defensive end J.J. Watt and Raiders guard Richie Incognito have been released. There is a caveat to this, which is if a player has less than 4 years of accrued NFL service, they have to pass through waivers to officially become a free agent. Every team in the league has the option to claim the player in the waivers process. If multiple teams claim the player, whichever team had the worst record in the prior year gets the player. That team does not sign the player to a new contract, but picks up the player's contract exactly as it was with his previous team. If a player goes completely unclaimed, he is a free agent. This is what it means when a player has been waived, although you will often see it incorrectly used to mean exactly the same thing as released or cut. The third way is when a team or player option is declined. If it is a team option, it is very similar to being released, and honestly, there is almost no difference aside from terminology. An option is included in the contract, and if a team declines to exercise that option, the player becomes a free agent at the start of the new league year. A player option is exactly the same, except of course, the player is the one who gets to decide. Player options are pretty uncommon, and often whether a player can even exercise the option requires a certain qualifier to be met, such as playing time. This year, both Broncos linebacker Von Miller and Jaguars tight end Tyler Eifert are expected to have their options declined. The final possibility is when a contract voids. Certain contracts are written so that despite there being 1 or more years remaining on the contract, it automatically voids itself at the start of a particular league year. Sometimes they are written to void no matter what, and sometimes they are written to void under certain circumstances. If you're wondering why this would ever be used, it's because it can offer teams flexibility with the salary cap in certain situations. Examples of voiding contracts this year would be Saints defensive tackle Sheldon Rankins and Lions defensive end Romeo Okwara. Next, I quickly want to go over the difference between an extension and a free agent contract. A free agent contract is signed by a player who is under no obligation to any team, and it begins immediately. It is negotiated based on the entirety of the contract, so to put it simply, a 4-year contract that totals $20 million is a contract that lasts 4 years from when it was signed and averages $5 million per year. A player can be in negotiations with multiple teams prior to the signing of a contract of this type. An extension is a contract signed by a player with the same team that he is currently under contract with. These contracts are negotiated based on the future. If a player signs a 4-year extension worth $20 million, but still had 1 more year remaining for $2 million from his old contract, he is now under contract for 5 total years, for a total of $22 million. A player in this situation can only negotiate with his current team. Contracts of both types are often compared side by side, but there is a distinct difference in them, and the extensions can be very advantageous to teams. Now I'm going to go over the various types of tags and tenders available for teams to use. Any and all of these can only be used on players with expiring contracts from your own team. You cannot use these on players with declined options, voided contracts, or those who have been released. We'll start at the lowest and move up from there. The ERFA tender, exclusive rights free agent tender. If a player has less than 3 seasons of accrued service in the NFL and their contract is expiring, their team can exercise the ERFA tender. This is a set salary, which is very low, under $1 million. The player cannot negotiate with any other team and has 2 choices: play under that tender or don't play in the NFL. Many low-level players will receive the ERFA tender, and you probably won't hear much about it. RFA tender, restricted free agent tender. If a player has exactly 3 seasons of accrued service in the NFL and their contract is expiring, their team can use any of the 4 types of RFA tender. Each level of tender has a designated salary. However, the player is not necessarily bound to that and can negotiate with other teams for a new contract. The caveat is that the original team who used the tender has the right to match any contract offered, and if they do so, the player must sign with them or not play in the NFL. The secondary caveat is that depending on the level of the tender, even if the original team declines to match the new contract, the new team may have to send a draft pick as compensation in return. I'll run through each level now, and the projected salaries I'm using I got from overthecap.com. The salary designated for each tier is set and does not change regardless of the position you play. At the lowest level, first right of refusal, a team gets the player for $2.133 million. If another team offers the player a contract, the original team has a right to match, and if they decline, they do not get any compensation. For the next level, original round, the team gets the player for $2.183 million. If another team offers the player a contract, the original team has the right to match, and if they decline, they must receive a pick in return equal to the pick originally used on that player in the draft. So if the player was originally drafted in the 4th round, the new team would have to send a 4th round pick in return. This tender can only be used on players who were drafted. At the next level after that, the 2nd round tender. The team gets the player for $3.384 million. If another team offers the player a contract, the original team has the right to match, and if they decline, they must receive a 2nd round pick in return. At the highest level, 1st round tender, the team gets the player for $4.766 million. If another team offers the player a contract, the original team has the right to match, and if they decline, they must receive a 1st round pick in return. This one is pretty uncommon. It is important to note that none of these are guaranteed. meaning that these are some of the most team-friendly rules in all of the NFL collective bargaining agreement. Now we will move on to bigger tenders, also called tags, which are generally reserved for players who have at least 4 seasons of accrued service. Similar to the RFA tenders, there are tiers which have designated prices and designated compensation if a player signs elsewhere. However, unlike the RFA tenders, salaries associated with each of these depend on the position of the player. Any team can use one and only one of these tags in any given year. I will show a chart of projected costs for each tag at the end here. The transition tag. This tag is calculated by totaling the top 10 salaries at a position for each of the last 5 years, meaning it takes into account 50 total salaries. The total of all 50 of these is then divided by the total salary cap over the last 5 years, then multiplied by the salary cap for this year. It is a bit convoluted, but ultimately the key factors are the top 10 for each of the last 5 years and this year's cap. The original team does have the option to match a contract offer from another team. However, they will not get anything in return if they decline to match. The non-exclusive franchise tag. This tag is calculated by totaling the top 5 salaries at a position for each of the last 5 years, meaning it takes into account 25 total salaries. The total of all 25 of these is then divided by the total salary cap over the past 5 years, then multiplied by the salary cap for this year. So the key factors are the top 5 for each of the last 5 years and this year's cap. The original team does have the option to match a contract offer from another team, and if they decline, they must receive 2 first-round picks in return as compensation. The exclusive franchise tag. This tag is calculated by totaling the top 5 salaries at a position for this year only, meaning it takes into account 5 total salaries. If a player receives this designation, they do not have the right to negotiate with any other team. You can take a look at the chart here as I give you a few final notes on these tags. These numbers are also from overthecap.com, but keep in mind they are projections, not absolute, since they depend on knowing the salary cap in 2021. The transition tag is uncommon because even though it is cheaper than the franchise tag, most teams want to ensure they receive draft picks in return if they cannot match the offer. The exclusive franchise tag is uncommon because it is more expensive than the non-exclusive version, and it is pretty rare that 2 first-round picks would be considered inadequate if a player ended up with another team. It's also important to note that a player is guaranteed 120% of their previous year's salary at a minimum for any of these tags. So, if for any reason one of these tags calculated out to be less than what they made the previous year, they are still guaranteed a 20% raise. They are also fully guaranteed if the player signs their tender, unlike ERFA or RFA tenders. Now we'll talk about the timeline of free agency and what it will look like in the coming days. February 23rd. Teams can officially start using the franchise or transition tag on their soon-to-be free agents. They have 15 days to do so from now. March 9th, 4 p.m. Eastern. Teams can no longer use the franchise or transition tag on their soon-to-be free agents. March 15th, 4 p.m. Eastern. With 48 hours to go until the official start of the new league year, teams can legally start to negotiate with pending free agents from other teams. No new contract can be signed, but players and teams can negotiate and even come to agreements in principle. March 17th, 4 p.m. Eastern. The official start of the new league year. Teams can now officially sign players whose contracts have expired from other teams. Generally, it's known that tampering occurs before the start of the legal tampering period, but it's rarely punished as long as it isn't too overt. The first wave of free agency lasts a couple of days, when most of the biggest players are signed, and a smaller second wave follows in the next few days after that. Thanks for watching, and let me know if you have any questions. Remember to like and subscribe, and you can find me on Twitter and Instagram at PanAmFootball.